call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call in respect of the Customs and Excise Joint Board of Management Sharing and Other Matters Amendment Bill and the related customs legislation. Mr Speaker, we have another occasion when the government, which is already overseeing a current account deficit, seems to be focusing its effort on making it easier for importers, making it easier for importers to import more goods at low cost, when we already have a current account deficit, which is because the cost of our imports and interest bill exceeds the value of our exports. So, Mr Speaker, while this legislation is not bad legislation, it really doesn't cure the underlying problems of the New Zealand economy, which is that we get poorer every year because the difference between the exports that we buy as a nation and the cost of our imports and interest bill is met every year by the sale of New Zealand assets and the borrow of more money from overseas sources. That's the only two ways that you can meet a current account deficit. You either sell some of the assets that you owned at the start of the year to an overseas owner, or you borrow money from overseas lenders. So, Mr Speaker, the shame of this particular legislation is that the government is once again seems to be unduly focused on the import side of the economy rather than the export side of the economy, and concentrating on changing things that would make a difference to our exporters. We heard the last speaker talk of the increase in trade to China, and it is true that there has been an increase in trade with China since the date of the free trade agreement that was negotiated under the last Labor government. But it also remains true that we actually have a trade imbalance with China, and that the cost of our imports from China exceed the value of our exports to China. So I wouldn't cry too loudly about that if I was on the National Party side of the benches. And of course, another difference between us and the National Party on the other side is that we think that in light of some of the substantial trade imbalances in the world, we should be moving to protect the sale of some of New Zealand's most important assets, like our land sale, stopping them being purchased by overseas interests, including the ones we didn't sell off in the 80s. Maggie Barry, you know, I would have thought that Maggie Barry, of all people, would understand that in a democracy, one of the ways that we progress is by learning from our mistakes and changing. Otherwise, we would be all stuck in time and there would be no point in having a democracy, because all of the decisions would have been taken in the 1980s and there would be no new decisions to be taken today. We in the Labor Party have a different view, and we learn from our mistakes, and we learn from the mistakes.
Order.
Mr Speaker, we hear from Maurice Williamson whenever he turns up and talks of a customs and legislation. He says it's more good news for the government, and it's a mantra that he has repeated so often that we have fun on the other side of the House thinking about what more good news from the government could come from initiatives around customs information sharing. And I suppose the question I would pose from the government in respect of this information sharing is, would these improvements to the system have picked up on the former Coalition Partner Act, David Garrett's dual passport? So it would be interesting to see to hear from a later call from the National Party whether the information sharing would have been sufficient to pick up the fact that David Garrett had not one passport but two. And for those who want a bit of information around that, you might recall that David Garrett, who was a supporter of the National Party, came to this House and railed against short sentences. He said everyone should have longer sentences, no one should have a discharge without conviction, and he also railed against name suppression, all the while having sought a name suppression and a discharge without conviction for his being caught with two passports, the second of which was from a dead baby's identity, the idea from which he got from some bizarre story in the Day of the Jackal, I think was his excuse at the time. Well, he had two passports, and I'd be interested to know whether the Customs and Excise Joint Management Sharing and Other Matters Amendment Bill would mean that SmartGate, or whatever it is that this additional customs improved systems in the customs, whether this would have meant that David Garrett would have been picked up earlier than he was picked up when he used one of his multiple passports. Mr Speaker, can I also reinforce the comments that were made by the Honourable Damien O'Connor, who raised this letter that's been received by us and forwarded to the government, suggesting that systems improvements are all very well and good, and no one objects to improvements in efficiency in the government service, but when it comes at the cost of biosecurity frontline services, as this person was suggesting, then there is a concern for us on this side of the House that there is a overall backward movement in the quality of our border security arrangements, particularly when it comes to biosecurity. Mr Speaker, Labor does support these changes in process because there are some sensible changes in here, but we do make the point that this is not the big game in town. The big game in town is increasing. Yeah, the big game in town is to increase our exports. We have for decades now imported more than we have exported, and every year we do that. Every year we do that. The cost of that difference is met. The cost of the difference between our exports and our imports and interest bill is met by selling our assets overseas and borrowing more money from overseas. The National Party don't like to talk about this because they've been trying to convince New Zealand. They've been trying to convince New Zealand that the issue for New Zealand is the government deficit. And the government deficit that the current government has run up, including through some unaffordable tax cuts, is quite dire and does need to be overcome. And it will be overcome by 2014, 2015. But the export imbalance will remain because the underlying imbalances in the economy has not been properly addressed by the government, and this bill doesn't do it. This bill makes some technical changes to the way in which customs and excise, joint border management sharing and other matters are dealt with, and that no doubt benefits importers more than it benefits exporters, and the imbalances in the economy remain.
I call the honourable member